So let's get started with the very first topic, that is cell membrane. Cell membrane happens to be so simple, but it is really very complicated part. Like if you look into the cell membrane, see how is the cell membrane? It is a lipid bilayer. ठीक है, तो first important thing is कि it is a lipid bilayer. This is the head portion, this is the tail portion. So we can see that the tail portions, they are aligned just opposite to each other. है ना? देखो ये head है और ये उसका tail, right? Like this. So जो बाहर का head portion है, this portion is hydrophilic phosphate. Hydrophilic phosphate. ठीक है, it is hydrophilic phosphate. And this tail portion is the fatty acid tail. Is the fatty acid tail वाला portion. ठीक है, सो ऑपोजिट जो अलाइंड है हमारे वो है हाइड्रोफिलिक और अंदर जो है वो है हाइड्रोफोबिक. इसका मतलब अंदर वाला पोर्शन जो है दैट इज having fatty acid tail is a portion that is lipid soluble. ठीक. Then this is the important thing. Now because of this structure, the most important property of the cell membrane is its selective permeability to lipids. Its selective permeability to lipids. So होता कैसे, जैसे देखो ये मॉलिक्यूल है, राइट, ये आपका फॉस्फेट है और इसके थ्रू इंटरमोलिक्यूलर गैप के थ्रू द सब्सटेंस विल कम विच विल डिसॉल्व इन दिस लिपिड सॉल्युबल एरिया एंड विल गो टू द अदर साइड. वाटर सॉल्युबल सब्सटेंसेस कैन नेवर पास. ठीक है, वाटर सॉल्युबल सब्सटेंसेस कैन नेवर पास. इंटरमोलिक्यूलर स्पेस के थ्रू लिपिड सॉल्युबल सब्सटेंसेस, गैसेस, स्टीरॉइड्स, दे कैन इजीली पास थ्रू द मेम्ब्रेन. So first important thing is the lipid solubility. The membrane permeability to lipid soluble substance. We'll write down all this. Okay, so don't be hasty. We'll write down all these things. Second important होते हैं कि इसमें there are proteins. You can see that the proteins, they are of two types. ठीक है, the proteins are of two types. Like some of them, they pass through the entire thickness of the membrane. Okay, some of them, they pass through the entire thickness of the membrane. These are called as the integral or the transmembrane proteins. मतलब अब suppose this is the thickness of the membrane, so entirely they will pass through the thickness of the membrane. The other proteins can be present only here in the cytosol. Okay, only here in the cytosol, or they can be present here on the extracellular surface. Okay, मतलब they could either be facing the ECF or they could either be facing the ICF. They are called as your peripheral proteins. They are called as your peripheral proteins. So there are some proteins which will pass through the entire thickness, but there are some proteins which are present either on the ECF or on the ICF. That means towards the cytosol. So they are just peripheral proteins. Another important structure is this carbohydrate moiety. You can see this carbohydrate moiety. Carbohydrate glycoprotein होता है जिसमें there is a combination of a protein and carbohydrate which is called as the glycoproteins. Okay, it is called as glycocalyx. It is called as glycocalyx. Right, so we'll write down all these. So you can see over here nicely it's shown that how the phospholipids have got a polar head which is hydrophilic, a polar head which is hydrophilic. So one head is facing towards the ECF and the other head is facing towards the ICF. और जो दोनों के फैटी एसिड टेल वाला पोर्शन है, ठीक है, जो दोनों के फैटी एसिड टेल वाले पोर्शन है, दे आर जस्ट ऑपोजिट टू ईच अदर, दे आर फेसिंग ईच अदर. सो दिस इज द स्ट्रक्चर. इट्स वेरी कॉम्प्लिकेटेड स्ट्रक्चर of the cell membrane. So we'll write down all these. So the thickness of your cell membrane is around 7.5 nanometer. Okay, the thickness of the cell membrane is about 7.5 nanometers. The cell membrane is containing maximum. So there are three things. There are proteins, there are fats, and there are carbohydrates. Okay, the membrane is composed of the three things. Proteins are, according to weight, about 55%. 45% are your fats, and just around 3% are your proteins. That means the maximum which are present are proteins. Maximum which are present are proteins. The only exception is your myelin sheath. The exception is your myelin sheath, जहां पर the lipids are more. Okay, वहां पर the lipids are more. So the important exception is that the proteins are maximum in all the cell membrane. The only exception is the myelin sheath where the lipids are more. Now, so the first important thing which we saw is this. Another important thing is that cholesterol is also present in the membrane. Cholesterol is present, but the triglycerides are absent. Cholesterol is present, but the triglycerides are absent. So this lipid bilayer is called as a fluid mosaic model. Fluid mosaic model. This lipid bilayer is called as a fluid mosaic model, where the fluid is the lipid portion. Okay, and the mosaics are formed by the proteins. So it is in the form of a fluid. It is not a very solid structure. Okay, it is not a solid structure. It is a fluid kind of a structure, and I'll tell you more about this fluid. So the most important property of the membrane is selective permeability. Selective permeability, and it is permeable only to, it is permeable only to lipid soluble substances. Lipid soluble substances, gases, steroids, they can easily pass through. So that means if I ask you a question, if I just tilt the question, lipid soluble substances will show what type of diffusion? Simple diffusion or facilitated diffusion? Simple diffusion or facilitated diffusion? What will be your answer? Simple या facilitated? Right? You can correlate this with your transport. What will be the answer? The cell membrane or the lipid soluble substances, they show which type of diffusion, simple or facilitated? क्या आंसर रहेगा? उत्तम, श्रुति, आकांक्षा, मुस्कान? So the correct answer will be that these substances will show simple diffusion because they are lipid soluble. They can easily pass through the membrane. Right? They can easily pass through the membrane. So they are going to show simple diffusion. No proteins are required. Very good, Akansha. Akansha ko mila very good. Good, Akansha, because Akansha has come up with the correct answer. Yes, Muskan. Uttam, it won't be facilitated. Facilitated will require carrier proteins, and facilitated is shown by lipid insoluble substances. Okay? Facilitated is shown by lipid insoluble substances, which could be water soluble. Okay, Uttam? Now, the proteins are of two types. As we saw, they could be peripheral proteins and integral proteins. So the peripheral proteins can be either facing inside, that is cytosol, or they can be facing outside towards the ECF. These will be, or yes, Uttam. This will be the cell adhesion molecules, spectrin, ankyrin. Spectrin and ankyrin are present in RBC. Integral proteins include your G proteins, your pumps, channels, even pores. That means anything which is allowing the transport of the substances through the cell membrane will be integral proteins, like glucose transportation or transportation of any other substance which is passing through the cell membrane will be integral proteins. Right? Now, as I told you that you have got membrane fluidity. So remember that the fluidity of the cell membrane is maintained by cholesterol. The fluidity of the cell membrane is maintained by cholesterol. And it's very important to maintain the fluidity of the membrane, because all the enzymatic reactions and the transport which occurs, because the proteins, they also show lateral diffusion. So one of the important feature of the proteins is that there is lateral diffusion of the proteins, right? So selective permeability, lateral diffusion of proteins, fluidity of the membrane, these are important properties of the cell membrane, right? Selective permeability, lateral diffusion of the proteins, fluidity of the proteins, and asymmetry of the cell membrane. Asymmetry in cell membrane. What do you mean by asymmetry? See, this is asymmetrical now, that proteins may be present somewhere, proteins may be absent somewhere. एक बात. दूसरा क्या हो सकता है? There are microvilli. Some of the cells, they may show microvilli, some of the cells may do not show microvilli. So the cell membrane is asymmetrical in structure. The structure of the cell membrane is not same throughout. Okay, the structure of the cell membrane is not same throughout. ठीक है? So integral proteins, peripheral proteins.